Right, today we're going to be looking at Arezzo. It's a slightly different lecture from the other two because I'm going to be concentrating a little bit on the town itself in the first part of the lecture, and in the second part I'm going to be talking in great detail about the station, at least the cycle of the True Cross by Piero della Francesca, which is one of the major works of the early Renaissance. And it's something that if you're interested in Italian art, it's that you really should know about as a reference point for later Renaissance work. This is actually St. Francis driving out the devils. We're going to be talking about St. Francis quite extensively. Arezzo is visited now by people who are interested in seeing the cycle of Piero della Francesca and also doing what is now called the Piero della Francesca Trail, where you go from Arezzo about 20 kilometres out to Borgo San Sepolcro, and then you go out to Monterchi, where he has the Madonna del Parto. So there's these three little towns that people go to, but they're astounded when they actually get to Arezzo, because when you go to Tuscany you tend to think of what, you know, Florence, Siena, San Gimignano, dare I say it, and so on. Whereas this is an extraordinarily elegant town. It has a very, very rich history. It has a number of museums, and it has a number of very important works of art, and some of the most important people in the Renaissance were born there. Petrarca, Vasari, and of course the father of modern music, Guido di Monarco. So I want to actually look a little bit at this town, and then we will spend the rest of the time looking at the Piero cycle. Now, on your seat, I hope you aren't sitting on it, it is actually the way in which the frescoes are set out in the Medici Chapel. Now, this is, you might think this is actually very intense sort of art history nitpicking, but it's very important, this interpretation of the way in which people looked at art in the early Renaissance. Anyway, let's get back to Arezzo. I just wanted to situate where Tuscany is in Italy, and I do this for the geographically challenged. I mean, I never actually got beyond sort of grade 3 geography because we always did glaciation and I found it so boring. So this is why I've actually shown you where Tuscany is. All right, now in Tuscany itself, you will find Arezzo over here. All right, so it's in a fairly hilly part. This is actually where the mountain range is. And if you go further down to Cortona, as you know, you'll be looking right out over the plains here into Umbria. So it's sort of more or less on the borderline of the Marche and Umbria. Now, I just wanted to look at Italy at the close of the 15th century. All right, now this will be because we're going to be talking about the position of Arezzo at the time of the Renaissance. And of course, Italy wasn't Italy. It wasn't united at the time. It was a number of kingdoms. Here you have the kingdom of Naples, which becomes the kingdom of Naples and the two Sicilies. All right, down here you have the Papal States, and that's actually quite important in relation to what we're going to be talking about Pitigliano. Then you have the Republic of Siena, then you have the Duchy of Florence. Up here you have Sardinia, which is aligned with the Piedmont. You have this extensive Venetian Empire, which goes down the Dalmatian coast. And you will recall last week we were talking about the great festival of the Censer, which is that's when the Doge weds the sea. This is to celebrate the Doge or Solo who conquers the Dalmatian coast. And by the way, these are called in Italian the Schiavone. All right, so when you're actually going along past the Ducal Palace along the Riva degli Schiavoni, it is the Dalmatian walk. It's nothing to do with slaves, all right? All right, so this is what it was like, a very fragmented Italy warring amongst itself, where you have two particularly strong factions, those who back the Pope, who will be known as the Guelph, and those who back the Emperor or the secular rulers, who are known as the Ghibelline. And these words are derived actually from Dutch and German words, which is quite interesting, but we won't go into that. Now, this is Italy when it is finally united later on. All right, now I want to actually look at Tuscany, first of all, going right back to its Etruscan roots. Now, as you know, the word Tuscan comes from Etruscan. This was a great civilization, which I don't know whether you realise actually extended up to Mantua, up here, and all the way down. It actually, at one stage, it was even further down than Rome, right down past into Campania. All right, so in 750 BC, this is what it owned, and this was up to 500 BC, it went down as far as this. There's always been a great sort of amount of controversy. Was Rome influenced by the Etruscans, or were the Etruscans influenced by Rome? But what is certain is that in 390 BC, Rome invades Veii, and that begins the decline of the Etruscan civilization. Which will continually decline. Now, elements of the Etruscan civilization remain very much in Rome. For example, the gladiatorial fights, which are a feature even of Republican Rome, and which come to their height under the empire, are begun in the Tuscan era. They are part of funeral games, right? Two people fight to the death so that one of them will accompany the dead man or the dead person into the next world, and this is elaborated on by the Romans, and also they've found in Etruscan graves the symbols of the Roman legions, which are the fasces, which are the rods and the axes, which of course are taken up by the fascists later on, who are trying to rebuild the idea of the Roman Empire. So these things come from the Etrurians. I just wanted to, before we actually start looking a little bit more at Etruscan civilization, just look at the countryside around Arezzo. This is actually around this little town Gimignano, where we actually have some villas, but you can see this sort of typical, the pencil pines, the olive trees, the vines, these sort of lovely little red-topped houses. And this is in Luciano, which is now in the province of Arezzo, which is a little town where all of the streets are concentric. So this is why you start at the bottom of the hill, and all the streets go round and round until you actually meet the cathedral. It's absolutely beautiful. Just some little views of it, just to get you into the mood of Tuscany. And of course, Cortona. All right, this is those of you who've laboured through under the Tuscan sun. We actually went there at the time when they were filming Under the Tuscan Sun, and it was very interesting because in the main square there was a polystyrene fountain, which looks like the fountain, the Trevi fountain. And we said, well, why have you got a polystyrene fountain? And they said, oh, well, the Americans didn't think that Cortona looked Italian enough. All right. Well, getting back to Arezzo, Arezzo was one of the 12 main Etruscan cities, and it was a centre of red ceramic ware. And in the museum at Arezzo, you can actually see these if you're interested in archaeological finds. Now, one of the great things that was found in Arezzo was this chimera, which shows that they were very skilled in bronze and in cast work. The chimera, as you know, was the brother of Cerberus, one of these monsters that has several heads. It was a lion which breathed fire, which had a goat's head in the middle of its back and then a snake's tail, and of course is killed by Bellerophon, the great hero, who can kill it because he rides Pegasus, the winged horse, and can fire arrows away from the bad breath or the fiery breath of the lion. It's probably a sort of a symbol. It's supposed to have come from, like here in Turkey, where there actually are gas things that come out of the earth and which are spontaneously lit, like ether or something. And so probably this was a way of the locals of explaining this sort of natural phenomenon, that it was really some kind of a beast. This was actually found outside Arezzo by Cosimo de' Medici, and is now in the Pitti Palace. And this, unfortunately, is just a sort of facsimile which is left in Arezzo. But what is interesting then about Arezzo is that it is a city which has evolved right from the very top. Now it goes up, as you can see, and we're right at the very bottom at the Porta Laurentino. Right at the top you have the cathedral, and you have something like 7 lots of walls, each one which is pulled down when the next civilization comes. And what has happened, which is very interesting with Arezzo, as we'll see, is that basically it went into decline in medieval times, and so apart from when the Medici took it over, it wasn't restructured, which means that you get a lot of very old buildings which remain. It sort of missed out on a lot of economic booms. It's a little bit like Hobart, which, well, I mean, no. It's a funny thing to say, no, but in the sense that it missed out on that boom in the 50s, 60s and 70s, and it means that you didn't get the appalling, brick veneer buildings that went up. You've still got a beautiful civic landscape in Hobart. That's what I meant. Got to be careful with you lot. All right. Now, this is, Etruscan civilization. You'll see this there. It was a civilization based on monogamy, and women were extremely important as well. As you can see, even on the sarcophagi, they actually have equal place with the male of the family. And of course, the Romans thought this was mad. They just sort of thought, well, they must have all been courtesans, these women. They couldn't cope with having women who were equal. These are the Etruscan black figure vases, which you'll see, which it meant that Arezzo, as it was called, was the centre of trade, right? And you can see these vases going out from Arezzo throughout the known world. Well, it was conquered, as I said, by the Romans in about 380 BC, and it becomes one of the major, in fact, the third major Roman city after Rome. Is Rome and another one, then Arezzo. And the Romans, of course, as they do, come in and impose their own city structure. So at the top of the hill you have this sort of maze of streets, and then by the time you get down to the bottom where you have the kind of castrum or the camp structure, you can see that it's very Roman. The Romans always had sort of horizontal and vertical lines. Everything was incredibly logical. You knew where you were. There was a structure about it. And this is left at the base of Arezzo. And also, of course, the Romans brought there public buildings. So you will see the remains of this amphitheatre. There were the public baths, there were libraries, there were gyms, this extraordinary sort of sense of mens sana in corpore sano. This is what's left of it. I'm actually not particularly good at reconstructing ruins in my mind. I mean, I look at this and I think, I find it very hard to imagine what that amphitheatre must have looked like. There are a number of finds in the archaeological gallery. It's quite interesting because Arezzo became completely Romanised, and it took a while, but the local inhabitants who were Etruscans thought that the toga was an absolute hoot. I mean, they couldn't stop laughing when they sort of saw the Romans arriving in this funny sort of skirt effect. But of course they did stop laughing by the 1st century BC. Now, it was a very important town in Roman history. I don't know if any of you know much of Roman history, but you will certainly have heard of the Punic Wars, all right, when the Roman Republic is fighting against Carthage, the domination of Carthage under Hannibal. And during the Second Punic War, the Lake of Trasimeno, which is probably about 20 kilometres south of Arezzo, was the scene of one of the major battles and one of the major victories of Hannibal. Right? Hannibal had force-marched his groups with his elephants and his troops up to the lake, and he was confronted by Flaminius. Now, Flaminius had a rather inflammable temperament, and Hannibal knew about this. Flaminius was camped in Arezzo, that was his main base, so Hannibal sort of started fires up through the countryside to make it look as though he's destroying all of the rest of this area. Flaminius took the bait and was lured by Hannibal to this very narrow strip of land round the Lake of Trasimeno. Now, the Romans vastly outnumbered the Hannibal's people, but Hannibal had his people hidden in the bushes, which probably doesn't sound like much of a disguise, but I mean they were hidden. He also had fires lit miles away, so that the Romans were confident. They thought, oh look, we can just get into formation. So the thing that the Romans were good at was formations, right? Remember, they used to get into these sort of what they used to call the tortoise, which was like a structure, and then they'd put their shields over them, and they were virtually impregnable, right? And they charged with a whistle blowing, and if you got out of rank, you were were court-martialed and taken off and killed. So the discipline was amazing. Unfortunately, Flaminius didn't bother about this. He was lured, and so he had his men coming in a very narrow single file, and the Carthaginians virtually annihilated them. In 4 hours, something like 20,000 Romans were killed. So this was the basis of one of the great victories all around Trasimeno. So you get a lot of history buffs coming around here. Rome, of course, under Constantine, in 314 AD, was Christianized, and you get some of the first Christian martyrs appearing in Arezzo. This is St. Laurent Ino and St. Pergentino. If you haven't heard of them or think, oh yes, I know who that is, I don't blame you. I've never heard of them either, but you get some this rather beautiful international Gothic style altarpiece to these saints in the museum there. One of the great bishops of Arezzo was Saint Donatus, and Arezzo had a bishop of its own, and it's one of the few cities in Italy where you know all of the bishops right from the very beginning of time, because they were also the lords of Arezzo until the Middle Ages. Now this is Saint Donatus, the miracle of Saint Donatus. You know, there's always these miracles. You know, there were 50 pagans who came racing into a church as he's about to serve communion, and smash the communion chalice, and he picks up the pieces bit by bit, except there's one bit that's missing in the bottom, but the wine doesn't flow out. So the 50 pagans, who I don't know what they've been doing in the meantime while he's picking up the pieces of it, are so amazed that they convert on the spot. So Saint Donatus is the saint of Arezzo, and the cathedral is named after him, and there's another church, and there's this great controversy all the way through from the Middle Ages, who has the body and who has the head between these two churches. It's a bit of a hoot. We'll look at that later. The first great person we will look at is Guido of Arezzo, sometimes called Guido Monaco because he was a monk. Very early, as you can see, he was in Arezzo because Arezzo became a centre of studies. They had what was called a studium, which is a kind of university. And Guido is the first person to actually invent or classify the stave, all right, the staff notation. And from this hymn to St. John the Baptist, Ut quaent laxes, you get, this becomes into do, so do, re, mi, fa, so, la, and then you get ti, do. And so until then, you had what is called pneumatic notation. This isn't a good example of it because you've actually got the lines of the staves. But people used to, when people were singing, the choirs who were singing in the church would have a very large psalmster like this, and they would know the melody. So they wouldn't be able to know the pitch, and it would just show you more or less the form of the melody, all right? So you just have signs going up and down, up and down. But Guido Monaco is the first person to transpose all of this onto staves and to be able to write out pitch and all of that sort of thing. So it was it's an amazing thing. Right, well, the families, there were very powerful families amongst who were the bishops, Tarlati and so on, always fighting. And at the time, by the time you're getting to about the 13th century, you're getting strange alliances being set up in the Italian peninsula, particularly around the Tuscan region. People became Guelph or Ghibelline, not so much because they were for the Pope or for the Emperor, but simply because they wanted the support of another powerful town. So, for example, the people from Arezzo wanted the support of Milan, they wanted the support of Forli, all of whom were Ghibelline. So they were Ghibelline, and you're able to see this in the architecture. We'll look at that in a moment. They always were against the Florentines. However, they lose the battle eventually through internal weaknesses, quarrelling amongst the main families, and they are taken over by the Cosimo de' Medici in 1384. And the Medici come in and get rid of most of the towers. I'll just show you that in a minute when we get to the main square. But the Medici, right on the hill, set up this massive fortress to make sure that the people of Arezzo know who is boss. And also Arezzo, of course, was a very strategic point for battles and so on. Now, it's about a little bit later than this time that the road between Rome and the north changes, and Arezzo is left off it, and so they begin to go into a decline from about the 14th century onwards, which is quite interesting. It's one of the reasons why they're taken over by the Florentines. Now, I just want to mention a major battle which takes place outside Arezzo in a little town called Angery, and this painting, those of you who know your Renaissance painting will know that this was the commission for this. There was a competition set up by the Medici for Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, as both of whom were supposed to paint this scene. And for some reason, Leonardo's sketch, which was on the wall, was lost, and Michelangelo's was taken away. And Rubens, this is a Rubens recreation of it. Now, Vasari, who is another great person from Arezzo, will eventually carry out the fresco in the Petit Palace. And he actually, at the top of one of these frescoes, has this little person saying, "Chi cerca trova," who looks will find. And art historians have thought that possibly this is a reference to the Leonardo cartoon, which is probably behind. Yeah, and so they've now done things with not ultraviolet, but there seems to be a gap. It looks as though he's actually put a piece of wall, and that there's probably another wall behind it, but they haven't. It's very difficult to remove it. So that's what's the thought at the moment. All right, now I just wanted to bring you sort of more or less up to date with, I have to mention the French, of course, and particularly the Bonapartes. Now, with the French Revolution, and particularly under Bonaparte, Tuscany is taken over. Now, you know that the French Revolution wanted to export itself and to liberate other countries which still had monarchs, and Napoleon does this as a general and as an emperor, and installs his family in different parts of Tuscany. He puts his sister Elisa, who's about the only one who sort of wasn't sort of nuts, in charge of Tuscany. Here you can see the Duomo of Florence behind. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this is that it's not perhaps, you perhaps don't know, that the French were very against religious discrimination, and so when they invaded Spain, they stopped the Inquisition. This is one of the first things that they did, stopped it and released the prisoners. And one of the first things that they did also in Tuscany was to stop discrimination against the Jews. And there is a small town just near Arezzo called Pitigliano, which you must admit is enchanting. It's built on this incredibly steep cliff, and it had several synagogues, 2 or 3 synagogues there, and it was one of the centres of the Jews who had fled the Papal States. And the Jews, of course, were not allowed to be town councillors, and were sort of discriminated against, and were in a ghetto. So one of the first things that the French did was to, bring down the walls of the ghetto, make them councillors. Now, this enraged the local Tuscans to such a degree that in Arezzo, a religious movement called Viva Maria began, and all the local thugs marched on Pitigliano and massacred it on the first day at least 17 or 18 Jews, broke down the walls of the synagogues, threw out of the sacred objects, and so on. Now, this began a massive movement against a rally call against the French, and in actual fact they drove the French back. The French had to then bring in extra reinforcements, and thank heavens actually finally reinstalled themselves in Italy. However, I thought this was quite an interesting episode. Now, if ever you go to Arezzo, it's really worth going out to Pitigliano, which still has some of the great Jewish families there. I want then to now look at Arezzo itself. Now, this is looking down at what we're going to be looking at, which is the Piazza Grande, and this is the loggia of Vasari. All right, the great humanist, the writer, the architect, and so on. Here is the cathedral over here. So we're going to investigate this area. I haven't got a video, but I'm doing my best. So what we're going to do, this is the sort of the lower part here, and you can see this is where the Roman part. Forget about this. I just got this off the internet. We go up here to San Francesco here. Those of you who've seen, have any of you seen Life is Beautiful? Yeah, well, that's actually filmed in Arezzo, and they go down in front of it. Then up here to this Piazza Grande here, up here, this is the Medici fortress here. We go up to the cathedral, up to San Domenico, and then down to Vasari's house and then down again. So you can see that San Francesco, which we'll be talking about here, is basically on the other side of the town from the Dominicans, and that's always deliberately done. All right, so this is this Piazza Grande, which doesn't have, I'm going to go round it. All right, it's a very large square, very large. It doesn't have many towers left. Now, as you know, if those of you who've been to San Gimignano, one of the types of architecture there were these very tall towers where people, each one wanted to outdo each other as family with the height of the tower, but also people could sort of enclose themselves there and be safe during sieges and so on. Now, these were mainly torn down by the Medici, who wanted to make sure that their only people who were loyal to them had a tower. So it's not a city of towers as you have with San Gimignano. This one here obviously was faithful to the Medici, because you can see by this type of architecture that square battlement at the top is Guelph and battlements. All right. Now, if you go round this square, now twice a year hosts this giostro kind of games of the Saracen. All right, and the Italians take their games terribly seriously, as you know, and so what you have is it reenacts the threat to Arezzo, and in particular to Christendom, by the Moors, all right, the Saracens, who at the time, and this, when we're talking about this, the True Cross, we'll be situating this at the time, was threatening Christianity through Spain, all right, and you also had the Turks, who were just at the point of taking Constantinople. So this, Christianity at the time was at a very crucial point. So these games are a kind of reenactment of this, you know, Christianity against the pagans, right, which is a major element in early Renaissance art. So this is called the Game of the Saracen. The city's divided up into 4 parts. They dress up into these most extraordinary outfits. So first of all, you have the flag wavers, you know, then you have the boys in the band, and then each of the 4 quarters of Arezzo come out with 2 cavaliers, 2 horsemen, dressed in these extraordinary outfits which are inspired from the Crusades. This one is from, I don't know which quarter he's from, but obviously represented by the eagle, and very faithful recreation of what people went off into the Crusades in. I mean, how people didn't get, I mean, how you could fight in something like this is absolutely amazing, and it's certainly not for the short-sighted either. In fact, perhaps they were so brave they couldn't see what they were doing. Anyway, that's the Sylvia theory of the Crusades. All right, so here we have the Saracen, who, interestingly enough, has black skin, and he is in the centre. And on one side he has a shield, and the other side he has a kind of whip that has lead balls on the end. So the rider has to gallop across at full speed across the square and hit this shield at a certain point. And according to where he hits it, he gets a certain number of points. And he also has to duck because he's going to be bombed on the head by these lead pieces. It always amazes. I don't know whether this has got any reinforcement in it, but it looks vaguely dangerous to me. Anyway, this is one of these great sort of things. It's in July and June and September. Right, getting back to the square, I'm going to go around to the right. All right, we've looked at these, this area here with the this sort of architecture. Now we're going. Right, I just want to talk then very briefly about the different. This is the Ghibelline battlements, all right, with a V. And this is the Guelph battlements here, which are, so that's a Ghibelline one, but these are straight. All right, so we've gone around, further around, and here you've got this extraordinary mixture of architecture here. This is Romanesque architecture. This apse, even though it was restored in the 19th century, relates to this very, very early church of Santa Maria della Pieve, who claims to have the head of San Donato. And there's a beautiful altarpiece in there that we will be looking at. You go along further up here to the law courts. This is, of course, a later era, and this is the building here that I want to talk about, which was started in the early times, and it has a mixture of Gothic, Renaissance, and late Renaissance architecture. There it is again. All right, now, this was a feature. It relates to Santa Maria della Misericordia. Now, It's a fraternità dei laici. In other words, it's a brotherhood, a secular brotherhood, which was attached to the church. Now, this is the sort of thing that you had in all of the Renaissance cities, and I think we looked at it even in Venice. Groups of people who are lay people who work in their particular district for the poor, for the orphans, for burial of other people, even provide scholarships for people to actually go and study and so on. And the people who support this often leave large donations in their wills to these particular fraternities. So they become very important parts of the city. Now, what I wanted to look at here is this was very early architecture. They ran out of money, so they then had Rossolini to finish this off, and finally Vasari is going to do the clock tower. Now, I want you to look down here where you have Mary, who is the sort of the subject of distributor of mercy, and the people around her are actually dressed in these hoods. Now, nowadays, of course, we identify this with the Ku Klux Klan. In fact, they have just simply taken this outfit from these groups of secular groups who are called penitents. And those of you who've done Spanish studies will know that these were particularly important in Spain, and that you still have processions in Spain in Holy Week when people all wear these different colours of these hoods. This was a flagellant order. In other words, they used to go around whipping themselves as well, and they were supposed to be anonymous because they're anonymous before God and so on. So these were the people who would, on these particular ceremonies and days, walk through the street flagellating themselves. This is not for women. Women weren't allowed in it. Now, what I want to look at here is something which I think is very interesting. It's a clock which shows the original way of looking at time. Now, we looked at a clock, didn't we, when we were talking about time, when we were talking about Venice. Well, this clock has the Roman numerals, but then it has 29 Arabic numerals, in other words, our numerals here. It also shows the phases of the moon and the phases of the sun, but you'll notice that the Earth is between the sun and the moon. So this relates back to the Ptolemaic idea of the Earth as being the centre of the universe. It predates Galileo's saying that we're not the centre of the universe. So it's a very interesting clock, and the mechanism is also built on one of the meridian lines as well. So it's very true in its judgment of time. All right. Well, we now go around. I'm sorry, this isn't a terrifically good view, but I mean, something's always happening. But this is Vasari's loggia, which really basically in the 16th century was given over to the nobles. All the shops were for the nobles, and this is where they used to meet. I think I've got a better picture. No, all right, well, during the first Sunday of every month you have a great antique market. Now this is actually better. You can see the sort of absolutely typical Renaissance arches and the sort of this serene continuity of time and space. Now, I just wanted, before I actually get on to Piero della Francesco, I want to just look very briefly at two great Aretines, people from Arezzo, Francesco Petrarca, who of course is known as basically the father of humanism. All right, now he's very early 14th century. He was probably the person who coins the idea of the Dark Ages. All right, and looks back at the time before the beginning of the rebirth of classical learning as being the Dark Ages. He's responsible for that term. So he was a scholar. The first thing, he was a great Latin scholar. He writes in Latin. He collects many of the manuscripts, particularly the works of Cicero, the letters of Cicero, and has them copied out. And he's probably the first person who says that even though he's profoundly religious and a profound Catholic, could not see any problem with being a Catholic and being someone who is interested in learning and interested in antiquity and the ideas of antiquity. His idea was that God gave man intellect to use it, and that action and progress is extremely important. So these are great humanist ideals which are formulated in Arezzo. He's also probably one of the fathers of the Italian language. At the same time, a friend of his who lived about 20 kilometres away in Certaldo, Boccaccio, I don't know that he wrote the Decameron, all right. He and Petrarca, and also of course Dante, who was in Tuscan as well, will form the basis of the Latin of the Italian language. Right, when Bembo formulates what is Italian, it is the Tuscan dialect that he uses. All right, and other types of Italian or other languages which weren't Italian at the time, which were spoken, are considered as variants of what becomes mainstream Italian. He's also known, of course, for the formation of the sonnet, which becomes one of the great versification structures, which will be particularly taken up by the Romantics. And more on a popular basis, he's known, of course, for this sort of ideal love that he had for a woman he met, or he's glimpsed several times, when he was in Avignon. And she was probably the wife of one of the Sards, the ancestors of the Marquis de Sade, so it's probably only just as well he only glimpsed her. So you get these extraordinary sonnets of, love and renunciation. He was actually a priest at the time. He was in the order, which didn't stop him fathering several illegitimate children. But when she dies, it's even worse, after having been torn between love and despair when she's alive. When she died, this didn't help things at all, in fact made it worse. So he's also one of the first people to become a poet laureate. All right, he's crowned poet of Italy by Colle di Rienzo on the Capitoline Hill, and that's why he's wearing the laureate, right, which is Laura, which he wears. So some people have actually wondered, whether she actually wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Is she symbolic of Laura, meaning the highest grades of poetry or not? Anyway, he was from Arezzo. His house is there where he's supposed to have lived. It's now turned into a very grand research centre. Now, the other person who was born in Arezzo is Vasari, right? The great Renaissance man, right? He was an architect and particularly a painter, and we'll see later on a great writer. Now, he was studied under Michelangelo and met all of the great painters of the early Renaissance in Florence, and came under the patronage of the Medici, and was considered one of the great painters of the day. He's no longer considered that, but his frescoes fill many of the Medici structures. He also, of course, designs the loggia at the Uffizi Gallery and the link between the Uffizi Gallery and another part of the building. This is in Florence. But he's most important, I suppose, for his histories, which is Le Vite dei più eccellenti pittori, dedicated to Cosimo de' Medici, the lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors and architects. So this really is the beginning of bringing together biographies of great artists. And although, of course, he doesn't have the research tools we have today, he's very informative on the lives of particularly the Florentine artists. Now, he doesn't think much of the people from Venice. It's only in his second edition that he begins to rather grudgingly acknowledge the greatness of the Venetians, particularly in engraving. Now, why? It's because he saw Michelangelo as the summit of art, and he conceived art history as like an organic life, moving from the early youth through to adolescence and finally into maturity with the work of the High Renaissance, i.e. Michelangelo. So this is where you get this idea of primitives, people, not exactly primitives, but Piero, when he writes about Piero della Francesca, he's seen as moving towards the High Renaissance, all right? So the idea of perspective, being perfected and everything as being the goal of art, right? And everything else as being seen as people not really knowing quite how to paint. And people still have this idea now when you go and look at some of those very early, well, for example, the Annunciation in the Sienese types of Renunciation against flat backgrounds. People thought, oh, they didn't know how to do things. They knew, but it wasn't important. It was a whole different mindset. So we're still very influenced by the ideas behind the work of Vasari. However, it's very interesting to go and get his work and actually read it. I mean, you can get it out of the library. They're very short, his lives of business. It's really interesting, even though he tends to sort of retell the same stories. Anyway, this is his house, and when you're actually there, it's worth having a look at the allegorical cycles that he has in his own house. This is his house there. Right, now, I really now want to spend the rest of this, well, almost the rest of this lecture on Piero della Francesco. This is the Church of San Francesco in Arezzo. As you can see, it has not been finished. Most of them would have had marble produced on the front. This has not happened. St. Francis was a major figure in the area around Umbria and Tuscany. Now remember that Assisi is probably, 40 kilometres away, maybe a little bit more. And St. Francis visited Arezzo on several occasions. Now, St. Francis was one of these orders in the 12th, early 13th century when there was like a mini Renaissance in many ways in the medieval world. And he forms the mendicant, one of the mendicant orders, all right? It's a reaction against the powers of the Pope, the structures of the Vatican and so on. And he and the Dominicans will form these two mendicant orders. I just want to look at that in a moment, but here what is important is the importance of the cross for Saint Francis, right? He receives the stigmata on the day of the elevation of the cross, all right? There are two feasts of the cross in the Catholic liturgical calendar, and so on the particular day of the elevation of the cross, and you have to remember this when we're looking at these frescoes, he receives the stigmata. So therefore, for the Franciscans, this concept of the cross is going to be extremely important. It's also very important because the Franciscans, although they split in many orders and they don't stay, some of the orders that they're split into don't stay true to the true mendicant concepts of St. Francis, become very powerful in the medieval and early Renaissance church, and are given by the Pope the custody of the Holy Cross, which is in Jerusalem. And so the Franciscans have custody of Bethlehem, the Temple of Jerusalem, and where the Holy Cross is. So they have three holy places in Jerusalem. And from this, they are going to transport little pieces of the Holy Cross throughout Christendom. All right? Now, you have to remember now that we're now going from the life of St. Francis now to 15th century Arezzo. And at this time, Christianity is under great pressure, all right? The Turks have pushed right through Libya, through Morocco, and they are threatening Constantinople as well. So once Constantinople falls, that really Christianity can no longer call itself a universal religion, and they are within striking distance of Rome, and they're really within striking distance of Jerusalem. So Christianity is under great threat, and it is the Franciscans who are going to be called upon by Pope Gregory the Tenth to preach the Crusades, right? They are great charismatic preachers, and if you read any of the work of St. Francis in particular, they really are amazing sermons. Now, he was actually a pacifist, of course, had a universal idea of respect for all things that are living. That's why you get this idea of preaching to the birds. However, the people who become Franciscans and who are these incendiary preachers like Bernardino of Siena, bigots in many ways, but they are great preachers and can galvanize the masses for a crusade. Anyway, I just wanted to show you the structure of the Franciscan church. This is Santa Maria dei Frari in Venice, because I haven't got inside of the other Franciscan, San Francesco in Arezzo. It was a church that didn't have aisles, all right? You didn't want aisles because you wanted to pack the masses in. And people stood up, there's none of this sitting down, all of this. You stood there and you were galvanized by these people who were these firebrand teachers. So it's a little bit like the Counter-Reformation, with this idea of getting people in, getting the youth, It's a bit like these charismatic things that are happening now. All right, so I want to now talk about the Golden Legend, which is the basis of this story of the true cross. You see, you'll all be converted, you see, by the time I've finished. I was, by the time I listened to myself speak. I think, oh, yes, I better go into an order. All right, now, the Golden Legend. Now, Bishop Joseph de Voragine wrote this particular thing in 1260. Now, what it was originally written, it's called the Legenda Aurea, for preachers. It's stories of the saints. Now, this is at a time when the majority of people can't read or write, and they get their idea of the scriptures from the sermons and from the frescoes, and particularly from the sculptures on the outsides of cathedrals. And people want to know more, It's not like the Woman's Weekly exactly, but the story of Mary, well, okay, there was the Annunciation and the Assumption, but what did she do? So you actually get pictures of the story of Mary. There she is bathing the child, and there's all little episodes, and episodes of stories of the saints, most of which are completely made up, often from their name, like Saint Sylvester, because it means silver means in the woods. There's these stories about him riding through the woods one day, and do you know what I mean? But people loved it. Anyway, in this Golden Legend, you get the story of the true cross, all right, which is quite important, not just from a kind of devotional point of view, but from a concept of world history. It talks about the 5 ages of the true cross, the cross, which is the death. Well, it talks about the 5 ages of history, which is the death of Adam. Then what happens? Then you get the Temple of Solomon, King of Jerusalem. Then you get the birth of Christ. Then you get Christianity going throughout the world with Constantine, and then the spread of it under the Byzantine Empire. So the story of the true cross can be taken on many levels, and it was adopted by the Franciscans in particular in the churches that they owned. And for example, Santa Croce in Florence has one of the great cycles of the true cross. Right, now people who paid for these frescoes, well, it would have been the noble families in Florence or in Arezzo. In Arezzo we know it's the Medici family, but they would not have decided on the cycle themselves. It would have been the Franciscans who would have decided what was painted and how it was painted, and the Medici would have given the money. However, they wanted to give money for this because they saw themselves as part of this cycle of the true cross, part of history, that this triumph of Christianity. See, all of history is seen as this triumph of history of Christianity against the trials of the Jews and the pagans and the devil and all of these things. And they see themselves as being movers and shakers in this by paying for the Franciscans to decorate their church, and probably paying for the order to preach the crusade and so on. All right, so it's quite coherent. All right, so at this time, the Franciscans are bringing back pieces of the true cross. St. Louis, for example, in Paris, brings out the crown of thorns and the Sainte-Chapelle. In fact, every city has their bit of the true cross. And in fact, Calvin makes the rather sardonic statement that if you put all the bits of the true cross together, you'd have an entire forest. All right, so this is the reliquary of the true cross in Notre Dame, and it forms this centre of pilgrimage. And San Francesco probably had it. Now, remember last week we looked at Bellini's procession of the true cross around the square of St. Mark's. All right, so there were 2 days of Santa Croce, again meaning Holy Cross in Italian. All right, so the connection then also with Arezzo is that the Franciscans start with a chapel outside the walls of Arezzo, but finally with Gregory the Tenth they are allowed to build inside the city, Gregory the Tenth being a Franciscan pope. All right. Now we have the connection between St. Francis and Arezzo. St. Francis was out walking one day and he sees this quarrelling going on, and so this is his faithful friend Silvestro, and he holds up the cross and says, "Devils, go out," and the devils are absolutely appalled, shriek when making a terrible noise, and fly out of Arezzo. So this is sort of this connection between St. Francis, the cross, and Arezzo. All right. Now, St. Gregory the Tenth is buried, actually, which is most unusual for a pope. Is not buried at the Vatican. He's buried in Arezzo Cathedral. Now, under his reign, he was attempting, and this is very important, the fusion of the Eastern and Western Church. The Eastern Church, being under threat very much by the Turks, as I said, needed the reinforcement of the West. And under Gregory the Tenth, Franciscans are sent out as delegates to bring the Pope of the Eastern Church, who is John Palaeologus, across to Arezzo, and he's actually comes through Arezzo into Florence, and nothing actually comes of this attempt at fusion of the churches. However, it does give Piero della Francesca the chance to see exotic Byzantine outfits which will appear in his clothes, in his paintings. All right, who was Piero della Francesca? He was born in Borgo San Sepolcro, in just outside Arezzo. Those of you who know, he actually painted a wonderful Resurrection, and this was written about by Aldous Huxley, saying this is the most magnificent picture in the world. And when the British were in the Second World War, were just about to bomb San Sepolcro because they thought the Germans were there, the fellow who was in charge of the British actually remembered having read Huxley and stopped the bombing. And basically San Sepolcro and the church was saved because of this. It's quite an interesting story. And he was made an honorary citizen of Arezzo afterwards. But we're not going to look at that because it's not where we are. All right, so the cycle of the True Cross. Now, it's thought that it was probably painted 52 to 56, which means that it's after the fall of Constantinople, which was in 1453, was it? 43. Anyway, but the dates, they're not sure whether this was actually 1443, wasn't it? 53, all right. So they're not sure whether it had fallen at the time, so that's interesting. All right, so we've looked at the True Cross as world history, but it's also this sense of the triumph of Christianity against all of the infidels, who are the Turks, pagans, who are the Romans, the Jews, and of course the poor old devil as well. So all of this will show you that. Now, it's one of these cycles which is extremely difficult to read, and every book that you will pick up will give you a different reading. What I'm going to give you is a typological reading where it's not narrative. I mean, it certainly doesn't just go duh, 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 and up the side. There are definite ways in which you can look at it, but basically each episode is succinct in itself and refers to the main message. All right, you don't actually have to go from one piece to the next to understand the first piece. Now, I'm showing you here because we're going to start up here. Up here. Now we're going to start up here. Right, we're going to go from there to there and across there. All right. All right, we start up here, and this has been very, very badly damaged. On this particular wall, it's very badly damaged. It's not all going to be like this. It was actually whitewashed in the 17th century, and then was only cleaned in the 60s and then restored again. But much of the colour has gone, and because a lot of the pigments have gone, often interpretations have changed. For example, is this the tree of life? Is it dead or is it alive? And so on. Now, Piero was famous not just for his artwork, but in particular for his work on mathematics and his work on Euclid. He published 3 treatises in mathematics, and he's particularly interested in perspectives and the use of pure form. But he's also a great innovator in fresco style. As you know, with fresco you put what's it called? The gesso on the wall, and then you put your cartoon across it, put nails in it, or actually stud it with charbon, I can't think of the word, coal, chalk, thank you, dark chalk, so that when you take it off you actually have the shape. This means that Piero, because he used this this technique, could use apprentices who would stick very closely to his structures. Now he also used oil paint afterwards, so he experimented with different types of paints as well. Anyway, in this top lunette thing, it's quite interesting what he does. He makes no attempt to give you a kind of foreshortening, because he gives you the impression that you are looking at it at that level. So you always you stand and you're only allowed in there for half an hour. And only 10 people are allowed in, 15 are allowed in at a time. It's quite difficult. You have to really sort of take it in. Now, so what you have here is a movement from right to left. And he begins with the story of mankind and original sin, which is part of the original idea of the story of the true cross. Because remember, this is the true cross, which is going to, if man hadn't sinned, you wouldn't have had Christ coming, and therefore you wouldn't have, if you hadn't had original sin, you wouldn't have had someone who had to come and redeem you from original sin. It's rather tautological thinking. But anyhow, this is called the happy sin, all right? So you've got Adam, who is dying and who is trying to explain to his followers here. This is Eve, who no longer is looking very resplendent, and she's got this sort of, the mourning use of the arms. He's explaining that he is dying, and his eldest, this is Seth, his eldest of his sons, goes off to see, and this is interesting, he sort of uses this sort of narrative thing, off to the gates of paradise to speak to the angel Michael, to ask if he can have the oil of life. Now Michael sort of says, sorry, no, but what I will give you is this branch of the tree of knowledge, which when it is planted in the mouth of Adam will eventually redeem mankind 5,000 years later, all right? So Adam, then you get this sort of structure. Here is the tree. Now the idea was that the tree of knowledge, of course, died or withered when they sinned. However, unfortunately, because this has been taken away, you can't see, but it is Seth actually planting the seed of the tree of life in the mouth of Adam. And of course, Adam was supposed to have died in the place where Christ was crucified, right? Golgotha. Golgotha means the place of the skull. Solomon was supposed to have found a skull there. So you've got this sort of geographical contraction of things already. Already you've got the cross coming out of original sin. Do you see what I mean? This is this whole idea of the triumph of Christianity. And over here you've got these people, this woman is lamenting, already very much in the lament posture. And over here we have two interesting people. Now what happens here is that Piero is experimenting with a structure of not just moving from left to right, but this girl here, that's them, here is looking across onto the main altarpiece and up, where she actually, I can't show you this, is actually looking at the prophet Jeremiah. Now the prophet Jeremiah has a scroll talking about the coming of Christ. Now in other words, already at the time of the death of Adam, she knows that salvation will eventually occur. Well, we now go down to the next level, all right? We're more or less at a little bit above eye level now. And you have a procession going this time from left to right. Here we have the Queen of Sheba, and the story is that the Queen of Sheba comes to speak to Solomon, right? The great wisdom of Solomon. She wants to hear of his wisdom. She is almost a necromancer. She's someone who has great foresight. And as she comes to this point, she falls down in wonderment. Now, why? Because Solomon, when he was building his temple, found this piece of wood, because of course the temple of Solomon was supposed to have been built on Golgotha, where Adam was crucified. It's all everything happens on the one spot. And this piece of wood was either too big or was too small. So in the end, he just threw it away. and some of his people use it to build a bridge. So when the Queen of Sheba comes, she gets to the bridge and she falls down and realizes that this piece of wood is of great significance. So she refuses to cross it or tread on it. So here you have almost in the form of the three magi. It's very much a reverent structure where you have these three women who are worshipping, and the Queen of Sheba falling down here. Now, as you go across, we go from the countryside into this structure, which is the temple, or the structure that Solomon has constructed. And you have the meeting between, there she is there, the meeting between the Queen of Sheba, who has taken off her crown, and as Solomon. And she will say to Solomon, someone who is much greater than you is going to be born, and this wood is connected with him. So Solomon will, of course, try and get rid of the wood, all right? But that's not what is really spoken about in this. You see, what Piero actually aligns are the rather petty elements of the story of the true cross. You know, he's going to be better than me, I'll get rid of it. It's these very solemn moments and the extreme restraint on the faces of the people or the protagonists, and the grace, and also the very formal ovoid use for the faces and the sturdy necks. She's taken off her hat and she has a veil, so in many ways this clasping of the hands, she's almost become not so much a pagan princess or a prophetess, but almost the symbol of sort of the church itself, the union of the church, the East and the West. Now, Piero has given Solomon the face of the potentate, or the person who was the Pope of the Eastern Church, who was John Palaeologus, all right? However, it is sort of showing again this idea of Christianity will triumph over the Jews, all right? Now, I just want to sort of show you the sort of the serenity and the nobility of these people who are attending her. Now, that's what I wanted to show you. That's the top, and you actually have, you can read many structures into this, but you have Adam dying here, and you also have the Temple of Solomon. Solomon, even though he's wise, he hasn't understood the real message of Christianity, therefore he still is on the side of death. Do you know what I mean? All right, whereas you have enlightenment here in the form of the Queen of Sheba and here. Now, what I'll be looking at eventually is that this one here that we've just looked at, the Queen of Sheba, actually is going to answer the one opposite, which will be about St. Helena. We're going to get a battle scene down here, which will answer a battle scene here. The invention of the cross here, which will eventually be reiterated in the elevation of the cross over there. All right? So it goes back and forth and in and out. There's so many ways you can read this. All right, so you see we're actually going to look here now, okay? We now get these slightly comic this is on the altar. I mean, it's very unusual. You'd imagine that you'd have the holiest of pictures on the altar. You actually have these people now who are removing this piece of wood, which Solomon has decided to get rid of, and he actually buries it in a pond, and it's going to finally, when Christ is going to be crucified, up pops the wood, and the Romans say, we'll use that bit, all right? So this is all this story, you know, anyway. So we've got these people now carrying off the piece of wood, and what is interesting is that you've actually got real country bumpkins. It's thought that this is not painted by Piero, all right, even though he did the cartoons for it. There's slightly, the faces aren't as pure. I don't know whether you can see that. I mean, those wonderful ovoids and the serenity of the eyes and structure. These are bumpkins, and this fellow here straining to pick it up, and he's straining so much that his socks have come down, and all the little bits and pieces are showing through his underwear. You've got this fellow here who's straining away. This fellow who's been out all night drinking. You know, he's still got a laurel with crooked on his head. But they've got this piece of wood that they don't realise is the true cross. But we know it's the true cross because this figure really reiterates the idea of Christ struggling, and also you can see the grain of the wood almost gives you the idea of a halo. All right. So this is what happens to it. Now, we now go back, and I want to now go from there down to here, all right? Well, we now go to, we've looked at the invention of the cross. We now go to an episode which is the Annunciation, which is not in the Golden Legend as part of the story, but it's put in by Piero because without the Annunciation you couldn't have had the invention and the elevation of the cross. You do have to have Christ arriving at some time. And Piero paints marvellous, majestic women, and this is one of them. Now, in this Annunciation scene, it's divided into 4 parts, traditionally. Now, you have up here God the Father, and the head of this person, I want you to remember when we're looking at another scene, all right, is throwing down his golden rays, which have become washed out, and impregnating Mary through her ear, which is why people, you know, in Renaissance times, and nuns always wore wimples over their ears, because the ear was considered to be a sexual organ. And so that's in that quarter up there. Down here we have Gabriel, who is dwarfed by Mary. All right, look at poor little Gabriel. He's a puny little angel, and he is actually saying Ave. Now, Ave, of course, is the paradigm, or the backwards Eva. All right, which is, in other words, that she is the second. She is the person who is going to redeem. Eva, it's the second coming, so therefore she will Mary will redeem what the first Eve didn't do. And he's also carrying not a frond of virginity, which is usually the lily, because this is no little shrinking violet woman. This is someone who is majestic, and what he is showing is the frond, which is often martyrdom, but is also the proof of immortality. So through the Annunciation, we will have the rebirth of Christianity, the chance of rebirth, which Adam, you know, messed up in the first place. All right. So then you get to the column here, which is sort of swelling in the middle, and this entasis represents the pregnancy of Mary. She is massive, and she represents Mary, the Church, Mary in her role as ecclesias. All right, this which in many ways was representing. She's the next step, I suppose, after the Queen of Sheba. So these great women of history. All right, and she's there in blue, of course, showing her holy nature, but the red showing that she is, however, a human being. Now we go up here to the building at the top, and you have the window which has a bar across it, which is the barred womb of Mary. You know, in other words, she was a virgin, but you get this little shadow going in, which is how she was pregnated. All right. So this is however, very important, because it is the first intervention of Christ or Jesus or God in the story of mankind. And now we go, there she is there, she's this majestic woman with this really sort of powerful, contained, sort of calm spirituality. We go back now down to here. Now, what do we have here? We have the great historical episode of the turning point of the triumph of Christianity, which is when Constantine, right, the emperor of Rome, in 314, or 313, the battle, has a dream. I had a dream. And here we have Constantine asleep in a tent, and we have all the other tents. It's about dawn. You can see the light is coming up. This is brilliantly done in fresco. I mean, it's amazing what it must have looked like at the time. And here we have one of his soldiers is opening up the tent and showing, he's sort of stopping us from getting in, and this fellow is stopping us from getting in here. We have the angel coming down. Now, the story is that Constantine had a vision during the night, and with the cross in his vision, and it said, with this cross, it was in Latin, you know, you will win. And he decided to take up the cross as his symbol in battle, and he wins. Now, of course he wins, because most of his legionnaires were Christians, all right? A lot of the legions that he was fighting with would have been Mithras followers, but he happened to have a group of Christians. And so it was a very shrewd political move. Look, I don't want to sort of, you know, take anything away from the divinity of the whole thing. However, it was a great political move. Anyway, the way in which, in the story, usually it's an angel with a huge cross, or it's something like this, but what Piero has done is that you've got this angel spiralling down, and the cross is tiny, but the importance of it is the light illuminating the world. And it's almost something that's going to be taken up in the 17th century with Caravaggio and the others. Well, getting back to this, the light, in other words, I have seen the light, illuminates the tent, and you have him in a position almost as though he's dead, all right? In those times, people didn't sleep flat. They slept on an angle because this was the position of the cadaver. And you have this particular servant in the position of mourning. So in other words, what we have here is the death of paganism, all right? The death of paganism and the birth of Christianity. All right, so we now go across to the bottom of the wall, all right? And we see Constantine in action, all right? And this is the triumph, the military triumph of Christianity now. At the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine defeats Maxentius, who was the other rival Roman. Actually, there's no slaughter in this. They are very, in a very steady, inspired procession. They're led by Constantine, who actually has the features again of this Eastern potentate. Remember John Palaeologus with the Eastern hat. Can you see that? Very not a Roman casket at all. And you've got this mixture of strange sorts of armour. You've got someone in a kind of medieval jousting armour. You've got someone in a Roman armour. You know, it's the idea of Christianity throughout the ages triumphing. All right, and they're triumphing under the eagle of Rome. And these people jumping across the bridge are in complete rout, and they have the standard of the Moor. Now this, of course, the black head represents the Moors who were coming up from Spain at the time. Now Christianity was defeating them, they were pushing them back. However, this is another great problem at the time. And the basilisk, which was a monster which could kill you with one glance. And so this is this idea of the pagans and the Muslims being vanquished by Christianity. It's not subtle. All right, so what we've done, we've come down there and we've looked at these ones here, and we're now going to go across to look at what the mother of Constantine's doing. Now, the mother of Constantine is no one else but Saint Helena, or Saint Helena. And she is another one of these women who are very important in the story of the True Cross. We've had these women who've had visions, all right? We had the Queen of Sheba, who's going to be opposite her, who has the vision of the True Cross. Now you have Helena, who has the vision of going and finding the True Cross. Now that her son has done the right thing and installed Christianity as the religion, she wants to find the True Cross. Well, she's heard that if you go across here, that there is a Jew who happens to be called Judas, who knows where the True Cross is. And so she goes across and tortures him. Well, I mean, as you do, all right? Now, he's shown being put down a well, 7 days of starvation. He comes up and confesses where the True Cross is. Well, after he's confessed, he witnesses miracles, we'll see. He becomes a Christian, and not only that, he becomes one of the bishops as well, and is martyred. I mean, he has an extraordinary career, this poor old Judas. Now, what is very interesting here is this was a very strong message to the Jews, all right? Now, one of the other great concepts behind the Franciscans, as they were in the 15th century, not the way St. Francis thought it, but the organised body of Franciscans was to preach the crusade and the conversion of Jews, all right? And it didn't matter how you converted them, all right? Jews at the time were obliged to come and listen to all of these preaching. They had to come whether they liked it or not. And so many of the frescoes here visualise the need for them to be converted, all right? And in fact, if you don't get converted, this is what's going to happen to you, all right? So it's not just by chance that you've got someone Jewish being tortured, all right? And the Jews were considered to have done all these terrible things, like, what were they supposed to have done? Put poison in wells, I mean, just the sort of, the usual, defiled the host, all these, killed young children or something. So there was this real anti-Semitism was part of the lower levels of preaching at the time. And one of the great preachers in the Franciscan order was Bernardino of Siena. And his portrait, I can't show you here, is actually up there, and he's looking down at this fellow being tortured. So they would have, the message would have been quite clear at the time, all right? It doesn't matter what you do, we've got to convert the Jews. This is, and you know, Christianity as opposed to pagans and Jews and infidels. We now go from here up to here. So now we're going to get a parallel episode with another powerful woman, which is St. Helena. So here she is over here with Judas, who's now being very helpful. And they've found that up pop the 3 crosses, all right? And they're looking in quite good condition considering they've been buried for 5,000 years, but they're miraculous. And of course Jerusalem here is in the background. But what is Jerusalem? Do we recognize Jerusalem? It's Arezzo. All right? So there's this conflation of paradise now. Do you know what I mean? This is all actually happening in our own backyard. This is so this is the Franciscan reference, the Aretine reference, the Jerusalem reference. So this is Arezzo in the 15th century. Now, here you will recognize the figure of St. Helena, very similar to that bowed figure of the Queen of Sheba. If you're standing there and you looked back across, you would see these 2 powerful women who have had intuitions of the true cross and the importance of the cross. So this is dug up by Judas, who knows exactly where it is. It had a temple to Venus over it. So of course St. Helena doesn't like that. She gets rid of the temple to Venus. Again, destruction of the pagan world by Christianity. But the problem is you've got 3 crosses, which is the real one. So they take it along over here, and I think I've got there we go. They take it over. There's a dead body being taken to be buried, and so they touch the dead body with each of the 3 crosses, and on the 3rd one, of course, the body gets up. So they realise that this is the true cross, and so it is installed in Jerusalem. Now, this is Jerusalem. Jerusalem here again are the streets, basically the streets of Arezzo, with these wonderful palaces and so on. Interesting headgear on these people here, again, which he would have seen when the Byzantine rulers came to Arezzo. Well, we now go up to down here, all right? And you're going to get a battle scene, which is now about someone who's stolen the true cross, all right? So in other words, see what I mean? You've got the problem starting here, revelation or intuition of the true cross, another woman who finds the true cross, a battle scene here where Christianity vanquishes the other, naughty Romans, bad Romans. Here you're going to have the vanquishing of someone who steals the true cross. And here he is, all right? This is the battle between the Persian Chrosos, Chroseos, or Khosrow, I think it was, and Heraclius. And the troops here of Heraclius are winning the battle against the Persian. Now, the Persian actually was a necromancer again, as a kind of, someone who had foresight, and he'd stolen a piece of the true cross because he wants to see himself as ruler of the world. And I'll show you this over here in a minute. All right, so in the meantime, you've got this extraordinary battle scene. Now, those of you who know Paolo Uccello and his battle scenes, you'll see this great similarity of the foreshortening of the horses, extraordinary sorts of, again, mixing of different types of armour. There's a body, a decapitated head over here underneath an arched body, and these extraordinary standards. Now, the standards of the goodies here, you've got the Capitoline goose, representing Rome. You've got Rome under the eagle. You've got, this is probably relating to the banner of the Anjou house. There's St. Louis of Toulouse was a Franciscan, and the French were involved in this as well. And here you get the Crusaders' cross. And they are, of course, vanquishing the standard with the Moor. And you've got this standard here, which has the moons of Islam being torn down and so on. Now, when you actually see pictures of Piero's work, you often see, this is the headdress or the outfit that you often see symbolising Piero's work. These were hats that he would have seen coming across with the Byzantine priests. Just sort of pictures of this. now over here. All right, now over, so this again you go from left to right. Do you know where we are? We're still in the same thing. All right, so here you've got Khosrow over here, and this was what he was going to set up. Now you will notice that you've got the true cross rising out of the throat of this guy who's being stabbed. And what Khosrow was trying to do was set himself on a throne underneath the canopy of heaven. You've got stars here. And he has the parody of the Holy Spirit, which is a dove, and it's now a cock. And here you have this which represents the Son. So he was going to be sort of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Anyway, his days are numbered. Heraclius says, convert or be beheaded. And of course he chooses, as you do, being beheaded. Those were the days. But if you look at the face of this man, and I couldn't get a close-up, he is virtually the same as that head of God the Father. And this is because he's being beheaded because he was trying to see himself as the Christian God. All right, now over here, you've got these two, thugs who are doing the beheading. Nice helmets, though. And the three people here, this one here is probably Medici, the person who commissioned the frescoes. So, I mean, that's all he gets, basically, apart from the right to have his family buried in the nave of the church. All right, it's a very small reference to himself, and there's different members of his family. So, okay, we've gone from there down to here. We now, Heraclius has got the true cross now. It's now on the feast of the elevation of the cross, and we go from there up to there. These are pictures of prophets up to the top, and we now get across from the death of Adam, all right, which started the whole thing of the need to have a cross. We now get the true cross going back to Jerusalem. And Heraclius now, this is Heraclius here, unfortunately, who's been a bit besmudged, is walking across with this amazing retinue of people. The trees now are blooming, none of these dead trees as on the other side, the tree of life. And an angel in the story of the Golden Legend, when he's about to enter Jerusalem, comes down and says, no, you must not go in with regalia. Remember, who else went into Jerusalem in a penitent way? Christ. So he immediately strips off the shoes and goes in as a penitent with the cross, and is met by these people who venerate the cross, and they've come miles outside Jerusalem, because the more important the person, the further you came to greet the object. So this is why Jerusalem's miles away. It's not because they couldn't paint it. It's to show the veneration of the people for the true cross. So in other words, there you've got this extraordinary cycle which encapsulates all of the history of mankind, all of the struggle and the triumph of Christianity against all odds, and even against the devil, who will be actually on the other side of the nave, incorporates the importance of the Franciscans and the importance of Arezzo in this cycle. Now, I've only got a few minutes to look at a few extra things. I want to just now quickly speak about another one fresco which is in the cathedral by Piero, and this is of Mary Magdalene. All right? And this exemplifies these extraordinary statuesque women that he painted. Now, at this time, people, the idea of the Magdalene was that she was a conflation of three Marys. All right, she was the Mary, the sinner, the prostitute Mary, the sister of Lazarus, and another Mary. But by this time, she's just identified as a prostitute. However, the message here is the idea of no matter how much you are a sinner, you too can rise through Christianity to great heights. And in fact, she is now interceding for us. And a lot of wealthy women who felt that they needed to repent had themselves painted as the Magdalene. All right, this was not an unusual thing. However, there's no one in this particular family who was called Magdalena, and we don't know what their private lives, so we're not sure why it's commissioned. However, you do get her standing, she's up at about this level in a painted recess, so you have the impression impression of this majestic woman. In fact, she's so big she fills it up. She's a bit like that Mary that we saw in the Annunciation. She's standing inside what they call a kind of an almond or an alveole shape, which also usually represents the angels. The orders of angels are often in this sort of almond shape, which is a holy shape, and this is reiterated by the shape of her cloak. Again, you get this sort of sturdy ovoid form of the head on a column-like neck, but she actually is a very taking person. What Piero does with his women is that he always paints one eye slightly different from the other, which is what it's like in real life. And in fact, he does the same thing with his Resurrection of Christ, and they transfix you. You know, you don't know quite where to look. Anyway, she's sort of looking down. Now, she is wearing the colours of faith, hope and charity, white representing faith, green representing hope, and the greatest of all Christian virtues, which is charity. And charity, of course, because she has been pardoned, but she's also holding what originally would have been the tools of her trade, in other words, some oil to anoint who knows who. However, remember that she was taking the oil to anoint Christ when he came out, but she went and she found the tomb empty. All right, so now what she's got is this extraordinary recipient, which was thought at the time to have been made out of rock crystal, and that they thought that rock crystal was some kind of frozen ice. In other words, it's a miraculous substance. Thank you very much. All right, and so and she's actually this foreshortening of her fingers. So this is this miracle that she holds. Now, at the end of her life, after her conversion, she goes into the desert and prays, and of course all her clothes fall off after they've been there for 50 years. So Jesus or Christ or God makes her hair grow to cover her nakedness. And so what you have here, can you see the stringy hair? This represents this old age hair which will grow and cover her. So even in her sort of beauty and her, her strength is reference to her old age and her salvation. So it's a very it's a compelling image. You can't see it on the screen in a sort of Hawthorne living room, but if you ever do get to Arezzo, as you might, do go and see it. Now, I haven't got time to talk unfortunately, about this Misericordia. I just wanted to, this is actually in Borgo San Sepolcro. This idea of Mary as the church, right, not just as the Virgin Mary or the mother of Jesus, but this very strong protective sense. And I wanted to show you this because one of the people who are protected by her cloak is, of course, one of the penitents wearing the penitent garb, and this is supposed to be Piero himself. Now, I'll have to go beyond that. I just want to very briefly talk about Santa Maria della Pieve. Now, this, as you walk up the streets of Arezzo, you get to this wonderful Romanesque front. It's got terrific carvings. I haven't got time. Now, what was interesting about this is that the church was originally independent of the cathedral. It belonged to the chapter of the quite a powerful group of priests who were there, the archie-priests, and they always sort of saw themselves as rivals to the cathedral. And the Pieve, which is this particular church, had the head of San Donato, which is in a beautiful sort of reliquary. Unfortunately, I haven't got a picture of it. And the cathedral had the body, so that was fine. They worked it out that way. They had different, on the Saints' Day, they managed to get their act together, so the head came out first and then the body came out later, and rivalry was relatively subdued. Well, unfortunately, in the 14th century, one of the noble families wanted one of the altars to be removed so that he could use it for his own family burial, and they came across a casket which says on it, "This is the body of Saint Donatus." Utter consternation, which is the real body. So this goes on for a number of times. So they're told by the Pope to rebury the body and shut up. All right. So about 100 years later, again, another family wants to be buried there, and out comes the body of San Donatus. This time the Pope again is called in, which is the real body. He decides that, again, be quiet. Anyone who talks about this will be excommunicated. So on a third occasion, and this is where Vasari comes in, he actually restructures part of this very, very old church. And so the inside is now a Renaissance structure, and of course up comes the body. And this time they decide they're just going to give it to the cathedral. So the cathedral's now got two bodies, and they've just got the head. So they've managed to work that one out. In the meantime, you get this really wonderful altarpiece, which is it's not much earlier, I suppose, it's about 120 years earlier than Piero, and I wanted you to look at it just to see the change in the artistic style, this beginning of this Renaissance, the idea of perspective being important, because you are in a real world. The real world counts, humanity counts. Whereas, of course, here, back in sort of earlier times, basically the idea is that the world is really just the waiting room for the real life, which is in heaven. So therefore, why do you want perspective? Why do you want to represent reality? It's nothing. So you get all of the background of this altarpiece is, of course, gold. The idea of entering the New Jerusalem, and the flattened figures represent the ethereal nature of it all. Now you get local boys here. I want to look at this in a minute. It is, of course, dedicated to Maria Assunta, the Virgin who is assumed into heaven. But we'll look at this in a minute. But here you get local saints, and I think this is what's quite interesting in these altarpieces. The local boys have done their bit for Christianity, but they're all local martyrs whose bones were probably buried beneath the altar, and that's why they appear here. And up here you've got women, which are quite interesting. You've got this is St. Catherine, remember, who's broken on the wheel. You've got St. Ursula. You've got St. Agatha. She's the one who had her breast cut off, and she's always with has a plate with two breasts. And this is Saint Lucy, who was blinded. So it's topped by female saints because it is the main character is Mary. I just wanted to show you. It's not a very good slide, but the great difference between that Mary of the Annunciation that we see 120 years later and this absolutely stunning. I think this, and it's all in gold. So you've got the gold pattern, which is more or less almost as though it's stamped into the background, sort of heaven as this eternal space. You don't want to have heaven with buildings in the background, do you? Brick veneer heaven. I mean, here you've got heaven, which is this wonderful sort of glowing ethereal space, but the pattern on Mary's mantle is quite extraordinary. You haven't gone into the sort of just the classic red and blue, and in many ways it reiterates the stamping on the pattern work in heaven. But you also get this sort of very intense gaze between the Christ child and his mother, and Mary there is not shown as a little peasant girl who's sort of stunned, who me. She's very much a wealthy patrician woman dressed to kill, in this extraordinary outfit. All right, now I'm not going to talk about San Domenico, which is at the other side of Arezzo. Inside you've got a crucifix by Cimabue. All right, this the main one is of course in Florence. So it's a major centre. Do you know what I mean? People just don't go there. We get to the cathedral. I haven't really got time. I haven't spent much time on this cathedral because most of this is done in the 19th century. It's been redone. Inside, it's these frescoes up here you can't see. A wonderful cenotaph by Bishop Guido Tarlati. He was, as I said, the lords of Arezzo were the bishops, and so he's got this incredible tomb which goes all the way up the wall, and it's all little bits of his life. It's like Trajan's column, but it's all flattened out. Nothing whatsoever to do with Christianity. It's my family and their goods and all of that. Then we get a lot of the Della Robbia, all right? Della Robbia, of course, who develops the technique of glazing so that they can be used on the outside of buildings and therefore are much cheaper than sculpture. This is one of the reasons why you get the prevalence of them. And of course, they had wonderful windows here, but they had to bring the French in. The French were the great glass makers, the great masters of stained glass. Stained glass isn't particularly important in Italian churches. They use frescoes much more. And I finally get to the last thing of Arezzo, and I thought because you've been so good, I'd show you at least one little restaurant with all these tartufo fresco, and then there's funghi, which mushrooms, and cantucci, little biscuits, and panforte, and there's the most wonderful little bistros and restaurants. So look, if you are ever in that part of Tuscany, do go to Lucignano, not Lucignano, but to Arezzo, and please go and see the cycle of Piero da Francesco, but you really need to book over the internet. to get in. You must remember that. Thank you very much. You've been very, very patient.